Today we welcome a brother whose research and knowledge we honor, Professor Stephen Zunes, speaking on Afghanistan, What Happened and Why. Dr. Zunes is Professor of Politics and International Studies at the University of San Francisco, specializing in Middle Eastern politics, U.S. foreign policy, and strategic nonviolent action. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Zunes.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I also just want to appreciate you all for doing the land acknowledgement. This has been a practice in Australia, New Zealand, and some other places for a number of years, and I remember first encountering it during a speaking tour in Australia about a dozen or so years ago, and I remember validating the host for doing that and saying, I wish this was more common in the United States. And I really appreciate her response. She said, you know, doing it was not a matter of being politically correct. It was just a matter of being polite. And I think that says it well. Although the rapid fall of the US-backed government in Afghanistan and the takeover of the country by the Taliban was stunning. I mean, many of us even those of us who like to think of ourselves as pretty good prognosticators were stunned at just how quickly it happened. Biden, of course, has defended his decision to US forces, arguing that Americans should not be forced to fight and die for a government when Afghans themselves were unwilling to do so. And it's been, but Afghanistan from the beginning has not always fit a standard kind of left-right kind of debate here in the United States. I mean, so you did have the right-wing interventionist, imperialist neoconservatives that launched the war initially, those in the Bush administration who saw the takeover of Afghanistan and the takeover of Iraq and the eventual takeover of Syria and Iran as part of a very clear-cut imperialist effort to try to reshape that part of the world under American control. But you also had liberal interventionists, those who cited the uniquely totalitarian and repressive nature of the Taliban. The treatment towards women and others was one of those, and given the attack on the United States by terrorists based in Afghanistan, that this is one of the rare situations where US intervention might be justified. Indeed, of the 535 members of Congress, only one, Representative Barbara Lee from the East Bay, voted against it. Among the critics, you had, of course, left anti-imperialists who oppose all US intervention as necessarily evil, necessarily imperialist, never justified under any circumstances. We also have this phenomenon of right-wing isolationists, who basically said, why should we be involved in nation building? Yeah, get rid of Al-Qaeda or whatever, but why should we be bogged down for 20 years in a war over there, America first, that kind of thing. So in other words, there are, it is not a simple, straightforward a kind of a pro or con thing that fits neatly into ideological orientations. Some of the debates about intervention during the Cold War. But I want to do my best as a scholar, but one who does tend to lean definitely towards the left, towards a very critical view of imperialism and of war in general, and to try to hopefully help you all understand a little bit of the dynamics here. It's certainly true that the Biden administration, like a lot of people, grossly miscalculated how quickly Afghanistan would fall, and it's quite reasonable there'd be a thorough investigation on why they failed to prepare for such a quick collapse of the regime. We think about the Afghan translators, government officials, human rights activists, and others, and serious personal risk under the Taliban. And so I should mention that part of the problem in failing to get people out sooner was that the Trump administration had pushed through excessive extra paperwork and other requirements for asylum seekers from Muslim countries. so that made it, that's what delayed a lot of people who tried to get out earlier from getting out earlier. And I'm really glad that the number of people in Congress, including Barbara Lee and Bernie Sanders and others, have really been pushing to keep the United States as open as possible for Afghan refugees. But despite the problems in the final weeks and days, I do believe that Biden was correct to follow through with Trump's agreement to withdraw U.S. forces, which polls show had the majority of at least 3/4 of the American public. We must not erase, though, the long-term role, a long time role in the United States creating this crisis. The current chaos and violence has been like 20 years in the making. Indeed, Biden actually delayed the withdrawal for several months beyond Trump's May deadline, which makes the claims by Trump and his supporters that Biden had suddenly decided to surrender to the Taliban particularly absurd. In fact, the Republican National Committee website had a whole page dedicated to how Trump had ended the war in Afghanistan, bringing the troops home, and how great that was. And the day the Taliban marched into Kabul, they took that down and replaced it by one attacking Biden for this supposed unilateral surrender. But just as Gerald Ford is not generally blamed for the communist victory in Vietnam, simply because he was president at the time the US-backed regime in Saigon finally collapsed, Biden should not be primarily blamed for the Taliban victory in Afghanistan. I mean, the Afghan army officially had 300,000 troops, which is 4 times the number of Taliban soldiers. In addition, they had an air force, heavy weaponry. They'd received hundreds of billions of dollars worth of training and weaponry and equipment from the United States, the world's military superpower. And by contrast, the Taliban had no significant foreign backing, no air force, only light weaponry they had captured, otherwise managed to procure through other means. In addition, since there are only 2,500 US troops in Afghanistan for most of the past year, and so their withdrawal should not have made much of a difference in terms of an overall strategic balance. As a result of Trump's deal with the Taliban back in early 2020, which did not include the Afghan government or our NATO allies, Taliban forces agreed to not fire on US troops in turn for their agreement to withdraw. Now, if Biden kept the troops in, they would have been subjected to relentless attacks, requiring bringing in more troops to protect them. And Biden is correct in noting that whether we had ended up withdrawing a year later, 5 years later, 20 years later, would it have made a difference? Would there have been a different result? I don't think so. Militarily speaking, there was no reason for the Afghan government to lose, and there's little more the United States could have done. It was not therefore a military victory by the Taliban. It was a political collapse of the US-backed regime. And it is hard to imagine that after 20 years of US support, had Biden decided to send still more arms, still more money, still more troops, there would have been a different outcome. In a sense, the policy in Afghanistan, I think it was Juan Cole who pointed this out.
No sugar.
Oh, that's right.
No cream.
Of U.S. policy there in the Middle East. He described it as essentially a Ponzi scheme, based on this unsustainable system, utterly dependent on foreign support, in which the eventual collapse was inevitable. And while Biden and others are correct to point out the corruption and ineptitude of the Afghan government, I'd caution people not to fall into this kind of Orientalist kind of idea, oh, those Afghans are incapable of governing themselves, because it was the United States that was largely responsible for setting up and maintaining that decrepit system. Rather than focus on rebuilding Afghan civil society from the bottom up, the US relied on corrupt and often violent warlords, tribal militias, opium magnates, and just about anybody else that considered anti-Taliban, even if they engaged in well-documented atrocities, even if they weren't much better than the Taliban in terms of the treatment of women. Even if, there were cases of these warlords who, in order to get rid of a rival, or who were jealous because of the land they owned, or maybe this warlord, had a debt or whatever. If they were in good terms with the U.S., they'd say, "Oh, this guy is Taliban," and the people would come in, and the U.S. troops would come in, and they would kill them, or torture them, arrest them, round up all the men in their village. There are many reports of people who, when we essentially had the Taliban defeated back in 2002, that had given up, gone back to their farming, whatever. But with the ongoing repression and the endemic corruption, you had to pay a bribe just to pay your utility bill. You had to pay a bribe, just to get a cop to check out a robbery or whatever. It was just so extreme. And this was not what the Afghans wanted. It's not what the Afghans would have built themselves. But the U.S. essentially imposed a system and maintained it through horrific violence. Again, widespread torture. Remember the Bush administration, and took the position, that if you were fighting the United States in our war on terror, you're by definition a terrorist. And if you're a terrorist, you are not a prisoner of war. You are not subjected to the Fourth Geneva Convention. So we could torture you. We could engage in collective punishment. We could violate all these very basic principles. Of course, society turned against them. Just that the majority of people in Vietnam's National Liberation Front, what we call the Viet Cong, were not hardcore Marxist Leninists. They were just peasants trying to defeat this corrupt, repressive right-wing puppet regime the U.S. had installed in Saigon, and to fight the foreign invaders. Similarly, most of the Taliban supporters, do not support the Taliban's reactionary theology or their repressive rule. They were seen as the vehicle by which which they could defend their homeland from these outsiders. And in this tribal society where there's a huge gap between the urban areas and the rural areas, and in many ways, the elites the U.S. had propped up in Kabul and elsewhere were as much foreigners as the Americans were. Despite the plea, and yes, the cost has been huge, over $1 trillion. The deaths of over 50,000 civilians, 2,500 American soldiers, 1,000 NATO soldiers, 4,000 civilians contractors, and over 75,000 Afghan soldiers and police. And I'm really yet to see a convincing case that extending the war beyond the 20 years we fought would have made anything better. And the thing is, there's never a serious attempt by the United States to crack down on the endemic corruption. We just continue to provide money and arms to the warlords, despite well-documented atrocities. U.S. forces would go on search and destroy missions, raid Afghan homes, remote villages, act like an occupying army. We bombed wedding parties. We bombed a hospital run by Médecins Sans Frontières. Most recently, we bombed the car of an aid worker employed by a California-based charity, killing him and 9 other innocent civilians, including 7 children. And the irony is that people are pushing this idea that Biden is not militaristic enough, and this is amazing. Remember, Biden stridently supported the U.S. invasion of Iraq. As head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he blocked anti-war scholars and others from testifying, including even barred former weapons inspectors who would have testified there are no more WMDs. He's repeatedly defended, as recently as a couple months ago, Israel's wars on Gaza, despite well-documented war crimes. He's insisted on maintaining an obscenely bloated military budget, even higher than that of Trump's. He has backed allied military dictatorships in Egypt and the Gulf and elsewhere. He's provided jet fighters to those responsible for the terror bombing of Yemen. Most recently, he's trying to push through a $500 million maintenance contract with the Saudi regime for helicopter gunships. The helicopter gunships have massacred villagers in Lebanon and attacked fishing boats and fleeing refugees and other civilians. I mean, Biden is as a hawk, and so the idea that he's not. What my point being is, if Biden thought there was a military solution to Afghanistan, he would have done it. He's not afraid to take pro-military positions. I mean, there are a number of things we can talk about, or other reasons things went wrong. The fact that when we essentially had won the war, we kept on backing the warlords instead of trying to incorporate the remnants of the Taliban who sued for peace. The way that we sent the attention of our generals of the Department of Defense, of the National Security Council, and the translators, the satellites, everybody away from Afghanistan and to Iraq in order to invade that country. And of course, Iraq complicated things because the tactics used by the insurgency in Iraq, such as the use of suicide bombers, improvised explosive devices, things like that, were then used by the Taliban with great damage. Similarly, ISIS is an Iraqi-led group that was a direct outgrowth of the U.S. invasion, and their presence in Afghanistan, of course, has complicated things there as well. And just another thing I just wanted to point out is that during the past several years, 1 out of 4 American casualties was from supposed Afghan allies, people in the Afghan armed forces that had ended up that we were working with, that turned their guns on Americans or brought in a bomb or something like that. And when you have that high ratio of people within your own ranks trying to kill you, that's some indication something's going wrong. but we kept on going. Think of Pete Seeger's Waist Deep in Big Muddy, just keep on doing it. The Washington Post has published a series of articles on how, particularly under Bush, the US government systematically lied to the American people about supposed progress being made, despite claims of strategic gains, by US and Afghan forces, the heavy bombing of the countryside, the search and destroy operations, raids on all this stuff. I mean, it was, and this is why we lost. It was not from withdrawing too soon. And in my 20 years of working with Afghans and Afghan Americans, including those from prominent political families, my strong sense is that most of them actually did support an active and ongoing US role in Afghanistan, but they believed it should have been at least, it should have been maybe 10% military and 90% focused on grassroots political and sustainable economic development, especially empowering civil society. Instead, US funding and the overall focus was just the opposite. It was like 90% military, and much of the development work consisted of top-down projects of dubious merit through corrupt elites that ended up stealing most of the money. And of course, no analysis of the Afghan tragedy would be complete without observing how the United States played a critical role in the emergence of the Taliban in the first place. Okay, in the 1980s, the Reagan administration was less interested in liberating Afghanistan from the Soviet-backed communist dictatorship and Soviet troops than it was prolonging a counterinsurgency war that would weaken the Soviets. They figured that the most hardline elements of the anti-communist resistance were least likely to reach a negotiated settlement and more likely to bleed the Soviets dry. And of the 6 major mujahideen groups fighting the Afghan government, the Soviet allies in the 1980s, 80% of US money and arms went to Hezb-e-Islami, led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was the most extremist, by far the most extremist of these mujahideen groups. He subsequently became a close ally of the Taliban. So when the Mujahideen finally won, about 2 years after the Soviets withdrew and became the government of Afghanistan, Hekmatyar insisted on having a disproportionate share of the power, well beyond his amount of support. And when his ostensible allies said no, he launched a war against the Afghan government. And with all this US weaponry, he had the military advantage. He had the high ground above Kabul. He shelled the city, killing thousands of civilians. And this ended up creating a much bigger civil war with multiple sides. It was total chaos in the country. And this went well into the 1990s. Meanwhile, though, in the refugee camps in Pakistan, and there are 6 million Afghans fled the Soviet invasion. And I should mention, as an aside, as terrible as the US air war and counterinsurgency was, the Soviets are far worse. I mean, they were responsible for hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. I mean, it was really, really horrific. Also in the name of saving Afghan women and fighting the Muslim terrorists and everything, similar rationale. But it was even more brutal. But anyway, you end up with five of these 6 million refugees ended up in these camps in northern in northern Pakistan. And there, the United States helped bring in the Saudis to set up these madrasas, these religious schools along very extremist and militaristic lines. Now, the rural Afghans had always been pretty conservative in their approach to Islam, but this hardline Salafist, Wahhabi, Wahhabist, kind of ideology was fairly new to them, and it was indoctrinating. And this whole generation of young men who know nothing but the squalor of these refugee camps became very hardline, very radical. And the US did this with the Saudis for the very same reason we supported Hizb Islami and Hekmatyar, because we wanted the most hardline anti-communist possible. And it was out of these madrasas came the Taliban, which is the Pashto word for students. And so these students of these US Saudi-backed madrasas then swept into Afghanistan after several years of civil war. And the Afghans were so desperate for stability and order, they let them in. And they did bring stability and order, albeit with this reactionary totalitarian rule. And and in their ongoing civil war, the remnants of the Mujahideen groups, they call themselves by this time the Northern Alliance, they control about 15% of the northern tier of Afghanistan. They brought in Al-Qaeda to contribute a couple thousand, 3,000 or 4,000 troops to help them fight. So when George W. Bush said, "Oh, Al-Qaeda is harboring, 3,000 or 4,000 Al-Qaeda terrorists," these weren't people who were being trained to hijack airliners and fly them into buildings. These were basically mercenaries helping the Taliban fight the Northern Alliance. I mean, the people who attacked us on 9/11 hadn't even been to Afghanistan. They got their, they were part of terror cells in Germany and the United States. They were trained in flight schools in Arizona and Florida, not in Afghanistan. Didn't have anything to do with it. In fact, the evidence suggests that the Taliban had no idea that Al-Qaeda was going to attack the United States. In fact, they made tentative offers to make a deal to extradite bin Laden, which would have avoided the war, but the U.S. insisted on moving in anyway. And indeed, of course, this brings the whole question about why a war on terror, as opposed to saying, more like a police operation, kind of like the operation that eventually killed bin Laden. High altitude bombing is not usually the best way to fight a network of underground terror cells, much less invade a country and go on a 20-year counterinsurgency war. But again, if there's any method to bin Laden's madness, it was for the United States to fall into a trap of these long, unwinnable Middle Eastern wars that would fit into his narrative that it's Islam versus the West. So So in other words, there's plenty of blame to go around for the tragic turn of events in Afghanistan, but should not be focused on Biden's reasonable refusal to break off the withdrawal agreement of his predecessor, which again would have led to more and more war. Like I say, it was a Ponzi scheme, and Biden happened to be the one to have the courage to call it out. And I think, despite my criticisms, a lot of Biden's foreign policies, I think he really does deserve credit for that. Briefly, and before I close, just in terms of of what's happening in Afghanistan now, I mean, they're reimposing, Taliban reimposing their restrictive theocratic laws towards women and others is obviously really troubling. So far, though they don't seem to be quite as bad as they were back in the 90s. They're no worse than the Saudis, which again, the US sees as an ally. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, the State Department, in justifying that helicopter maintenance contract, referred to the family dictatorship in Saudi Arabia as a friendly country that continues to be a force of stability in the Middle East. That's a direct quote from Blinken, from the State Department. Indeed, it's interesting how much the mainstream media coverage on whether Biden's refusal to continue this endless war demonstrates a lack of commitment to human rights and democracy. You know, while his strident support for the Sisi regime in Egypt, the family dictatorships in the Gulf, the Israeli and Moroccan occupations, where changes in US policy really could make a difference, that remains largely unchallenged. And my concern, though, is as reports of Taliban atrocities, will be coming out in the coming, weeks, months, years, we must not allow the advance of a narrative which argues that the war in Afghanistan should have been bigger and longer, and that Biden's inadequately supportive of US intervention overseas. We need to fight the spurious accusations from the right which could lead future presidents to needlessly prolong unwinnable wars. I mean, we must challenge the notion that anti-American extremists, Al Qaeda, ISIS, Taliban, engage in terrorism because they hate our freedoms. And well, we certainly should be proud of our, individual freedom, democratic institutions. The fact is that most people in the Islamic world don't see our freedom and democracy at work. They see "Made in USA" on tear gas canisters and bomb casings. I think that when it's very sad, of course, to think about what's going to be happening in Afghanistan, and I think as Americans, left, right, and center, I think a lot of us have this idea that we ought to be able to do something, but it's a complex world out there, and we really can't do everything. The one little bit of hope I see in Afghanistan is that despite everything, there has been at least some emergence of civil society, at least in the urban areas. Kabul, for example, is a city of 6 million. The Taliban cannot control everybody there. We've already seen signs of resistance, not just the demonstrations, which unfortunately have been brutally suppressed, but in 1,000 ways, small steps of non-cooperation, by the Afghans. And as awful as the Taliban may be, every government, is ultimately, and no matter how repressive, is ultimately dependent on the cooperation and acquiescence of those under their rule. And so I do believe, that there will be ongoing resistance, passive resistance, more on the individual level immediately, but I do not see Afghanistan, being permanently under this kind of a reactionary rule. They have too much of their own contradictions. And also Afghanistan, the world is a lot more interconnected than it was 25 years ago. that it's much more interdependent. The Taliban, realizes that they need to have exchange of the world. 8% of their budget was from foreign aid from the United States and other countries under the previous government. They got to feed their people. They have to have basic things operate. They're going to have to deal, with the international community in certain ways, and they know if they're too draconian, that would be more difficult, and that also might encourage them to moderate somewhat. I don't think there's been a change of heart in the Taliban. I still think they're as reactionary and misogynist and everything as ever. But I think both the pressure from below and pressure from the outside, especially if it's strategic, and not just knee-jerk, let's sanction them all and starve them kind of thing, but carrot and stick, some kinds of thoughtful international effort and support for what civil society remains. This is probably the best we can hope for the future of Afghanistan. But the main thing I want to emphasize right here is let's not use this as an excuse to make the argument that we should have just continued this unwinnable war even further. So I'll stop here, and I'm open to questions.
Martha Hubert raised her hand with a question. Martha
Dickinson, I think you mean.
Well, I just call. I'm just somebody texted me that whoever. Please do, and please do ask your question.
I have a question.
Martha.
I like your analysis very much, Stephen. And my concern has been for some time. I think we should have gotten out anytime. And I think we should be grateful for the diplomatic way we got out. We ought to be praising more the diplomacy that went into that, even though in spite of all the mess. But my concern too is with the sanctions, rather brutal sanctions the United States and others are now imposing on Afghanistan. That means medicines, vaccines, things can't get through. Shouldn't we oppose all those sanctions?
Yeah. I think certain. I've long been an advocate of smart sanctions. When you're dealing with with particularly nasty regimes, that is, that you make sure that those who are impacted by the sanctions are the ones who you're actually trying to target, and does not hurt individuals. This idea of if you have people suffer enough, they'll rise up and overthrow the government. I think already most Afghans would rather have a different government than the Taliban, and starving them is not going to make that happen any sooner. And also I think that if sanctions are going to work, there needs to be a carrot as well as a stick. That we have these kind of sanctions on these kind of issues, and we will lift this sanction here if you do this. But basically, U.S. Traditional U.S. world sanctions. We're going to take total sanctions of the country and whatever, and no matter what you do, we're not going to lift them unless we replace it with a government we like more. That doesn't give the government any incentive to change their behavior.
Well, do we have much diplomatic interaction with the Taliban government now?
I think we had our first meeting just yesterday, and it was more on technical issues. Right now, we have no diplomatic presence in the country or anything like that.
Peter Tannen has a question that he put into the chat. It's, would you agree that Afghanistan is a collection of tribes more than a country, and that its people primary alliance is to their tribe?
Afghanistan, of course, is an ancient civilization or civilizations that have been there for many years, and again, they've been famous for fighting off invaders from the Greeks to the Mongols to the British to the Soviets, and now the United States. Though this resistance was not generally in the name of the nation state, that's largely a Western construct. And of course, the specific boundaries that make up Afghanistan are pretty arbitrary. The Pashtuns, which are the largest tribe, are divided between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And by the way, just a little footnote, there are stereotype of the Pashtuns are very violent people. They are the base of the Taliban. It was Pashtuns on the Pakistani side of the border, which was then India during British colonial things, had a movement known as the Red Shirts, led by Ghaffar Abdul Khan, who Gandhi considered his greatest satyagrahi, his greatest nonviolent warrior, the bravest, most disciplined of all the peoples in India, and resisting the British occupation in nonviolent Gandhian methods. And so I think so I just want to underscore this history of resistance of the people in that part of the world does not inherently mean violent resistance. But going back to the original question, one of the people in Afghanistan, elsewhere, of these tribal societies that have been put into nation states, they don't mind interactions with the government. And, they would like some occasional goodies, economic development projects and things that would help them, and support if there's natural disasters, and protection if there's threats of one kind or another. They just don't like to being controlled by them. And one of the things one of the big mistakes the U.S. has made, we've done this in Yemen and some other places as well, this idea, well, terrorism comes because you have a lack of central authority. We need to strengthen the government. And it's real, of course, that ends up creating the very reaction feeds groups, like the Taliban. And so I think many of the basic assumptions this kind of idea of imposing a Western model and thinking that it will somehow stabilize the country, with the Western nation state model, instead of stabilizing the country, usually ends up doing just the opposite.
David David Hartsow and his wife, we have a question.
Thank you, Stephen, for a very thoughtful presentation. My question is, after this disastrous experience of the U.S. war in Afghanistan for 20 years and in Iraq for 18 years, that have gotten us zero security in terms of the U.S. in the world. And they also seem to be getting ready to try to fight a major war with China. Do you see any indication of people in Washington using this time as an opportunity to rethink how we relate to the rest of the world and how we get security for the American people and really for people all over the world?
I think there's been some serious rethinking about getting involved in long counterinsurgency wars, the U.S. troops on the ground. Of course, we thought we'd learn that lesson in Vietnam, but I think it's been underscored. And so I do not see us getting involved in another Iraq or Afghanistan style war, at least for another generation, or whenever the amnesia starts to creep in again. But I don't think it has unfortunately changed the overall mindset, the overall militaristic mindset. The fact that the increased technologies, with drones and that kind of thing, it will make it in many ways more tempting to intervene. We have, in addition to Afghanistan and Iraq, the U.S. has been involved in no less than 7 other countries in the militarily, either through airstrikes or troop presence and small-scale troop presence like Syria, or drone strikes and occasional commando raids. I mean, this kind of thing. And especially with these new technologies, I mean, it's yes, the Biden administration, like the Obama administration, rejects torture, but you don't have to worry about torturing terrorist suspects if you kill them first. which is sort of what the drone policy does.
Hmm.
And while drones are very accurate in terms of their targeting, and it's not like the carpet bombing we did in Vietnam or the Soviets did in Afghanistan in the 80s, where they just destroy everything. It's based on your targets are often based on faulty intelligence, and a lot of innocent people die, and the evidence is pretty strong that even the drone policy has created more terrorists than it has killed. So yeah, I think there's less worry about a big ground war for the foreseeable future, but the overall mentality of militarism, intervention, and trying to find military solutions to complex political problems. Unfortunately, I don't think we've learned that lesson yet.
If I could follow up with a question, how do you feel the American people can best influence our government to rethink this whole question of how do we get security, and fighting these wars, even with improved technology, is in our interest?
I mean, I think there are certainly strong moral and legal arguments we can put forward, but again, I'd also put forward the utilitarian arguments that it just ain't working. And what's interesting about this is that we've seen two things. So one is public opinion polls show that in addition to younger people having much more progressive positions on a number of issues, ranging from LGBTQ issues to immigration to the inequality to
climate change,
social democratic or even socialist direction, things like that. There's also the anti-interventionist sentiment and skepticism of militarism is very, very high as well. I've really noticed in my students over the years, and the empirical data from polling indicates that as well. What's also interesting is that among Republicans, there is a dramatic growth of a kind of almost a return to the 1930s isolationism that was a hallmark of many Republicans. That there isn't a clear and present danger. Why should we be wasting our money and our lives? In fact, it's mostly working class. Working class kids are sent off to do these wars. And what's interesting is a lot of people forget is that one of the reasons that Trump won was that he outflanked Hillary Clinton on the left in terms of foreign policy. Mm-hmm. Kept pushing the idea that I'm not gonna send your kids off to these endless wars that Hillary Clinton supported. She supported the Iraq War. She supported Afghanistan. I oppose it. He was lying. I mean, right? Trump actually did support it as well, but he tried to put, Clinton's record was much more clear, much more obvious, and in fact, what's interesting is that empirically, if you look at the areas that shifted most dramatically from supporting Obama in 2008 and 2012 to supporting Trump in 2016. And the northern tier states, Wisconsin and Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, the ones, the ones that gave Trump the electoral college majority, they parallel almost exactly the areas with the highest casualty rates from Iraq and Afghanistan.
Wow.
Almost exactly.
I want to stop the flow just for a minute, Stephen, because there is a question from Jim Barnett, and then there's also a question from Dolores and Dave.
Yeah, but just real quickly, just to summarize the significance of that is that I think it's not just the left that is skeptical about U.S. militarism now. That there is the sense is growing. We can find allies. Like some may have heard of the Quincy Institute, which is an interesting combination of left and right and centrist anti-interventionist, anti-militarist that is having some impact and influence now.
Occasionally we hear on TV about bombings, I guess terrorist attacks in Afghanistan now. I guess there is competition between ISIS and the Taliban, that's my understanding. And so my question is Afghanistan likely to enter into a civil war? And secondarily, my understanding as a non-expert is that a great deal of the turmoil in the Middle East can be comes from the very old competition between Sunni and Shia Muslims. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think we'll see a civil war in Afghanistan because I don't think Islamic State has that kind of has that much support, but they can certainly engage in terrorist bombings like they did at the Shia mosque just a few days ago that killed scores of people. And the Taliban's kind of caught, if they try to moderate, they're afraid they might lose some of their supporters to the Islamic State, and so just as they're getting pressure both internally and internationally to moderate somewhat, they're also getting pressure to go back to their more hardline stance. I think the whole Sunni Shia things have been exaggerated. I mean, the Sunnis and Shias theologically aren't have less differences between them than Protestants and Catholics have from each other. It's not a matter of centuries of hatred and things like that. There are some religious wars hundreds of years ago, but again, just when we've seen Protestants and Catholics, fight each other, the only one in recent years has been Northern Ireland, and that's because they happen to parallel, a different historical national identities. The Protestants with the British Unionists, and the Catholics with the Irish Republicans, and so. And the whole Sunni Shia divide has largely been a result of outside machinations. The French in Lebanon, the United States, and Iraq, and efforts by the United States, which has exacerbated divisions from the Saudis and Iranians, which some people then embrace some of the geopolitical rivalry that between the Persians and Arabs. That does go back centuries, but some demagogues will try to put on the religious thing. Of course, ISIS, which is a direct outgrowth of the U.S. invasion of Iraq and imposing a theocratic Shia regime to fight the secular Ba'athist and some of the Sunni groups, things like that. I mean, the division is largely a result of outside intervention. It is not. There are plenty of places where in the Islamic world where Sunnis and Shias live in peace. Intermarriage is not uncommon. If there's one mosque in a village, Sunnis and Shias will worship together. It should not be that big a deal. It's much more the consequence of foreign interventions, manipulations, a divide and rule. Now, of course, these things can then take on a minute of their own, and it'll take a while to calm things down again. But I would reject the idea that this is the source of our turmoil in the Middle East by any means.
David, do you want to ask your question now? David?
Yeah. Oh,
Or do you want me to read it?
are we muted? No, I'll scroll up. Okay, the chaotic last week of withdrawal from Kabul seems to have been due to faulty intelligence or faulty use of intelligence. For example, that the Afghan army could hold out for 1 or 2 years in spite of Taliban advances in the countryside and even some cities, which seems to have been well documented. So what is your...
Yeah, from the little bit I've heard is that the military intelligence did give an overly optimistic works to the Biden, to Biden, and Biden at their word, and so that was so yeah, but there's this phenomenon that the United States has often relied on untrustworthy allies in Afghanistan, taking their word about something when they shouldn't. And of course, there's also the phenomenon in any bureaucratic organization that no one wants to be the bearer of bad news. And so a field report on the ground may be kind of negative, but as it works its way up the hierarchy and eventually gets to Langley, Virginia, or Washington, D.C., whatever, it's been toned down enough so that it's no longer an accurate reading.
Interesting.
And Dolores's question about the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, I'm pretty negative about him, to be honest. I very much opposed his nomination. My first encounter with him when he was when Biden ran the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he was the chief staffer there. And again, he was partly responsible for allowing for only a day and a half of hearings on the Iraq war. And again, it was stacked with pro-war people. Even 80% of American or 90% of the American Middle East scholars opposed the war. They wouldn't let us talk. They wouldn't even let Scott Ritter, the chief weapons inspector, testify. He's been a big hawk, big supporter of the right wing in Israel. He's much more AIPAC than J Street, if you follow those kind of politics. He's very, he's buddied up to all these various dictators. I follow him on Twitter, and he, every day he comes out with several things, and it's amazing how the contradiction's so obvious, saying all these really eloquent things about rights and democracy, international law, and quite justifiably criticizing Russia and China and Iran and countries for violations of various international legal norms. And then, then 10 minutes later, there's a post of him smiling and shaking the hand of the foreign minister of some US-allied dictatorship, and praising our cooperation and security and stability and that kind of thing. And I think there's a tendency we have right now is because Biden has been surprisingly progressive on a lot of domestic issues, and the attacks against him from the right are just so outrageous and extreme. There's a big pull to try to defend Biden as much as possible, and but in general, outside of Afghanistan and a few other areas, the foreign policy has been pretty disappointing. I mean, we're looking at it looks like most people in this call are old enough to remember people like Hubert Humphrey and Scoop Jackson, who were Democrats who actually did have very progressive domestic agendas, but were those who pursued foreign policies that were quite problematic in terms of militarism and supporting dubious allies. And Biden is very much in that camp, in the tradition of the Democratic Party.
Bob Birchfeld, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I really enjoyed this presentation and all of the information, and it's just an incredible tour de force. One of the things of Taliban history that seems to be present now, which is the Pakistani involvement, and how Pakistan is trying to kind of downplay their own role in supporting the Taliban. And of course, the Taliban got their start with Pakistani support back in the 90s. There's also the support of Islamism by the Saudis and Saudi ambitions. So I was wondering if you have any observations along those lines that you might want to share with us.
Pakistan has played a major role in Afghanistan for a long time, and I mentioned 80% of U.S. arms going to Hizb Islamic. In part, it was to try to lead part was to because we thought they'd be more aligned against the communists, but it was also because the major it was the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence, that was the major of U.S. arms and money to the Mujahideen. And Hizb Islamic was their preferred Afghan ally as well. And the Taliban were based in Afghanistan before they moved into Afghanistan in the late 90s and took over, and it was an open secret that there are elements of the Pakistani military intelligence that were directly supporting the Taliban, helping them cross the border, and like. And I mean, I remember, and the Afghan government has been complaining about this for years, how the United States has been giving Pakistan a free pass. The most dramatic example was, I think it was in 2007, when there was a summit between President Karzai and President Bush. And Bush was going on about the Iran support for the Taliban, and Karzai was like, this is actually while the cameras were rolling, and Karzai, actually we're cooperating with Iran. They're helping us suppress the Taliban. They're anti-Shia extremists. They have murdered Iranians and Shias and others, it's the Pakistanis that are supporting the Taliban. Pakistan has definitely been a problem, but it's one that, if for various strategic reasons, various U.S. administrations has repeatedly tried to downplay.
Didn't Bob, didn't you ask about another country in the region that you were also concerned about?
Right. Yeah. Saudi Arabia, the Saudi.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah.
For especially for madrasas, in Islamism in general.
Oh yeah. I mean, they're a huge problem, and again, that's the roots of the Taliban come in part through the Saudi role, and they got tons of money, and so they can in many areas, especially poor rural areas in Central Asia, like in Pakistan and Afghanistan, these Salafist madrasas are the only religious education, sometimes the only education period. And that's why people like Malala Joya and people like that have been saying, if you want to fight extremism, build schools, not drones. This idea that you fight extremism by bombing villages in my country, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere, that just creates more people, more terrorists. You need fund education. A secular education, general education, do grassroots economic development. I mean, that's what she's been pushing for years, including in her well-publicized meeting with Obama when he was president. This idea, I mean, and just sort of the general trend we've seen since Rumsfeld of sort of contracting out, the whole privatization thing, of saying, oh, well, Americans get upset when we intervene directly. We'll support our allies, the Saudis, to help us out, and given how reactionary and dangerous these are. I mean, it's just unforgivable a pass we're giving, the slaughter of tens of thousands of people in Yemen, a country that still beheads women for alleged witchcraft. I really thought the murder of a Washington Post journalist might be enough to finally get the U.S. to stop supporting Saudi Arabia. But again, as Blinken says, they bring stability, they're our ally, and this is just outrageous. I mean, it's really upsetting the way that we give the Saudis such a free pass like that. I mean, yes, they're rich enough and influential enough that they can do plenty of things on our own, but we could also do a lot to curb their influence if we decided to, or at least stop supporting them.
Do we have any other questions? I don't see any little hands going up. Aha. Is that Dolores or David's hand?
Dolores.
Okay.
Professor Zunes, you brought up a really important point for ordinary citizens to choose what they're going to do, because while we support Biden's domestic agenda, which is stuck in Congress, but we have, myself, abhors his foreign policy, especially under the leadership of Anthony Blinken. I mean, it's just outrageous. And then the military's budget is so huge, and they feed the American people all this phony militarism, just like the Blue Angels flying around the Bay Area right now. And like, how can we protest that? Because our representative, Nancy Pelosi, backs him to the hilt, so we can't do that. And I just want to thank Martha Hubert for what Code Pink does in making public statements, and they get a lot of publicity. But I mean, publicity is, a lot of Americans, and especially working class people, they're exhausted at the end of the day. They can't, they just easily understood policy is hard for anybody to,
I think one thing we could emphasize more is the whole guns and butter thing. Like, everybody's talking about how this $3.5 trillion infrastructure package is supposedly too expensive. Well, this is over a 10-year period. So we're talking 350 billion a year. The military budget, if you count the Pentagon, which is around 750 billion a year, plus the nuclear and other aspects of the energy department for nuclear weapons, plus the military side of the CIA budget. So if you put them all together, we're talking at least 950 billion a year. And the Biden's package actually has ways of paying for it, whereas the military budget just goes deeper and deeper into the national debt. And yet, what I've been reading in the paper almost every day, oh, how expensive this package is that might, bring the United States just a little bit closer to what most Western industrialized countries have already in terms of paid parental leave, in terms of support for child care, elder care, all the, and not to mention all the important things we have to have with climate change. I mean, so, I really think that, and my God, we are one of the safest countries in the world. We're protected by 2 oceans and 2 weak and friendly neighbors. We're not under any threat. Yet not only do we have the largest military budget, we are among the top 5 or 6 in military spending per capita. I mean, really, it just doesn't. It doesn't make any sense. And I think we really need to push, push this the whole thing a lot stronger.
I just wrote a letter to the Chronicle, and all you have to write is 200 words. They have an extremely controlled system for sending them letters. But maybe if everybody in this entire talk this afternoon.
Yeah, the more letters people get on a topic, more likely they'll publish them.
That's right. It just doesn't, one person is not enough to yell about the military budget, but we've got at least, in this group, we've got at least 24 people who could be sending the Chronicle letters, and they could all arrive within this next few days. Then maybe one of them would get published. I mean, these are figures that are just appalling, just appalling. I know that somebody,
I'll respond really briefly to Jim's question about the Taliban destroying schools and other development that did to come to power.
Right.
That's often the tactic of insurgent groups to destroy things that might give credit to the government. Remember the Contras that we supported in Nicaragua would routinely blow up healthcare clinics and schools and other things that the Sandinistas had tried to establish. But of course, the Taliban, in addition to that, are a pretty reactionary group. They don't really believe in education outside of along their lines. I mean, and of course, religious fundamentalists do this all over. I mean, think about the attacks against public education by fundamentalists in this country. Not physical attacks thus far, but yeah, this is not surprising, unfortunately.
There was one other question, and I'm afraid I didn't catch.
Megan Lemmer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to say my daughter works at the Pentagon and she does alternative energy development. So not everything is just war-based. Yes. She does alternative. And these are major projects.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I mean, the Pentagon.
Geothermal, wind, solar.
Yeah,
so it's not just all military based.
Yeah. The Pentagon, is the world's single biggest carbon polluter. But there are professionals, civilians within the Department of Defense, that are recognizing this, and also recognizing that the climate change is creating instability, refugee flows, all sorts of things, and that it's in the national security interests of the United States to address these issues, and among those institutions need to address it is the Department of Defense itself.
Yep.
So yeah, thanks for pointing that out.
And all of their buildings are all zero energy use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But of course, one could argue that that's great, but it doesn't make up for all the carbon footprint from all the jets and the aircraft.
No, but they are doing some very good work.
Yes, that's true. So thank you, everybody. If this is anything more, I'm glad to see this turnout. I'm glad to see you all engaged, and thanks for listening. If you are, if you can hold on one moment, I will post links to some recent articles of mine that address some of these issues. This was an article I wrote right after the Taliban took over that got mostly a positive response. I also have a website that hasn't been updated in a few months, but hopefully it will be shortly, where you can access other articles. And finally, I would, if you want to be on my email list, of which I send out, short articles, policy briefs, once a month or so, you can email me and ask to be put on that email list.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Thank you so much, Professor Zunes, and I hope we'll be calling upon you again. So we hope to see you again soon.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks a lot.
Professor.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you.